An 8-year-old girl silenced a packed conference in Atlanta when she asked an unexpected question to Katherine Williams, one of America's most influential women. What happened next moved everyone to tears. The auditorium of the Atlanta Community Church was filled with a surprising blend of scents that autumn afternoon. The fragrance of polished wood and fresh flowers filled the air as hundreds of people settled into the rows of oak pews. At the front of the pulpit, Katherine Williams, founder of the Williams Foundation and one of the most successful women in the country, adjusted her microphone. Katherine was an extraordinary presence. At 42, her dark skin glowed under the soft lights, and her navy blue dress exuded natural elegance. She had risen from the streets of South Chicago to build one of the largest social investment funds in the country, becoming a symbol of hope and determination. Among the well-dressed crowd, one small figure stood out. Lucy Anderson, an 8-year-old girl, clutched an old Bible tightly in her small hands. It was an heirloom from her late grandmother, its worn and gilded pages telling stories of years of devotion. Her aunt, a church volunteer, had managed to bring her to the event. Lucy had been practicing her question for weeks. During school breaks, she scribbled the words in her diary. At night, she whispered to her favorite doll, carefully rehearsing every word. It wasn't just a simple child's curiosity. It was a question that weighed on her heart ever since she had lost her grandmother 3 months earlier. Katherine began her speech as she always did, sharing stories of resilience and purpose. The audience occasionally murmured in agreement, some taking notes, others simply absorbing every word. The sound of the church organ still echoed softly in the background, creating an almost sacred atmosphere. Lucy remained still in her seat, her fingers gripping the worn edges of her Bible. Her Aunt Grace, seated beside her, occasionally patted her back, a silent gesture of encouragement. The girl hardly blinked, her brown eyes fixed on Katherine as if seeking answers to questions her young heart could barely articulate. When the time for questions came, an organized line formed along the side aisles. Community members, local leaders, and admirers asked questions about charity, leadership, and social change. Katherine answered each one with the wisdom and grace that had made her renowned. Lucy hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she held her precious Bible. Her Aunt Grace leaned in and whispered gently, "If your heart is telling you to ask, then it's important enough to be heard." With those words, Lucy rose quietly, her small patent leather shoes softly echoing against the wooden floor as she walked toward the aisle. The murmurs in the church gradually subsided as people noticed the small figure walking toward the microphone. Some smiled tenderly, while others watched with curiosity as Lucy, clutching her Bible tightly to her chest, approached the center. Katherine watched intently from the pulpit, something about Lucy's quiet determination touching her heart. There was a familiar vulnerability in that child, something that reminded her of herself many years ago when she too sought answers to profound questions. The silence in the church was palpable as Lucy approached the microphone. Her small hands trembled, but her steps were resolute. Katherine Williams observed closely, noting how the girl held the Bible as if it were her greatest treasure. The line of people waiting to ask questions seemed endless, but something about Lucy's presence made everyone step back respectfully. An elderly lady in the front row smiled gently, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, as if recognizing the importance of the moment about to unfold. Lucy finally reached the microphone, needing to stand on tiptoes to reach it. For a moment, only her soft breathing echoed through the speakers. Katherine leaned forward, her pearl earrings glinting under the church's soft lights. "Mrs. Williams," Lucy began, her voice small but clear, "what does God mean to you?" The impact of the question was immediate. The simplicity and depth of those words seemed to draw all the air out of the room. Katherine Williams, known for her eloquence and presence of mind, was silent for several seconds. The crowd waited, holding their breath. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, eager for the answer. Aunt Grace, still in her seat, clasped her hands in silent prayer. Katherine stepped away from the pulpit, her heels softly echoing as she descended the steps toward Lucy. She knelt to meet the girl at eye level, her gaze locking onto Lucy's with an intensity that made the entire room seem to disappear. "Lucy," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight no one had expected. "That is the most important question anyone has ever asked me." Katherine paused, her hands gently touching the Bible Lucy held. The silence in the church was deafening, as if even the air itself was waiting for her answer. The rays of the afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows, creating colorful patterns that danced across the polished wooden floor. Katherine took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was heavy with emotion. What she said next would not only change Lucy's life, but touch every person present that unforgettable afternoon. "For me," Katherine began, her voice soft but firm, "God is not just an idea or a set of rules. He is the reason I'm here today." She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "When I was young, younger than you, Lucy, we lived in a poor neighborhood in Chicago. My mother worked 3 different jobs, and many nights we went to bed hungry. But do you know what we never lacked in our home? Faith." The church remained utterly silent, every person present completely absorbed in the story. Lucy held her Bible even tighter, her wide eyes fixed on Katherine. "One night," Katherine continued, "when I was 10 years old, our house caught fire. We lost everything, absolutely everything, except for one thing, the Bible my grandmother had given me, much like the one you're holding now." Katherine gently touched the worn cover of Lucy's Bible. Her hands trembled slightly, and several people in the audience were already wiping away silent tears. That night, lying in a temporary shelter, I opened that Bible. And do you know what I found inside? A note from my grandmother that said, "God has not given you a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and self-discipline." Those words changed my life. Lucy nodded softly, an almost imperceptible motion that showed she perfectly understood what Katherine was saying. "So, Lucy, when you ask me what God means to me, I say that He is the voice that whispers to me on the darkest nights, telling me that dawn is coming. He is the strength that made me believe that a black girl from Chicago could change the world. He is the reason that, even when I lost everything, I never lost hope." Tears now streamed freely down Katherine's face, but she made no move to wipe them away. Lucy too began to cry silently, her small hands clutching her Bible even tighter. God is that moment when you feel you can't go on, but something inside you says, just one more step. He is that embrace you feel when you're completely alone. He is the answer when there are no answers. Katherine's voice trembled slightly, but she continued, her eyes fixed on Lucy's. What she would say next would touch the hearts of everyone present even more deeply. "Do you see this?" Katherine asked softly, pointing to the Bible in Lucy's hands. "That book you hold so carefully reminds me of my own journey. When I was young, my grandmother used to say that faith is like a garden. It needs to be nurtured every day, even when we don't see the flowers growing." Lucy nodded, silent tears still streaming down her cheeks. The entire church seemed to be breathing in unison, every person completely immersed in the moment. "There were times," Katherine continued, her voice growing stronger, "when people told me I wouldn't make it. that a black woman from South Chicago could never build something meaningful. But do you know what I did in those moments? I opened my Bible just like you are doing now and found strength in the same words your grandmother probably read as well. A soft sob echoed from somewhere in the congregation. Aunt Grace covered her face with her hands, her own tears now flowing freely. God, for me, Lucy, is that voice that told me to keep going when I lost my first job. He is the love I felt when my mother passed away and I thought I couldn't carry on. He is the strength that made me get up every morning, even when the world seemed to be against me. Katherine gently took Lucy's small hands in her own. And now, looking at you, I see the same light in your eyes that my grandmother used to say she saw in mine. That light that says you have important questions to ask, that you're seeking something deeper than money or success. The girl squeezed Katherine's hands as if that simple touch could convey all the understanding her young heart felt. God is love, Lucy. Not just the kind of love we feel when everything is going well, but especially the love that sustains us when everything seems to be falling apart. It's the love that made me build schools in underprivileged communities because every child deserves a chance, just like I had. The afternoon sun now cast a golden halo through the stained glass windows, bathing Katherine and Lucy in an almost ethereal light. The moment seemed suspended in time, sacred in its simplicity and depth. When I was 13, Katherine continued, her voice now softer, I lost my grandmother. Just like you, Lucy. I felt so alone, so lost. But it was in that moment that I truly understood what God meant. Lucy clutched her Bible more tightly, her wide eyes filled with recognition. The congregation remained in absolute silence, many nodding their heads in quiet understanding. One night, after the funeral, I was so sad that I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor of my room and started flipping through my grandmother's Bible. And do you know what happened? I found little notes she had written in the margins. Words of hope, strength, and love. Katherine paused, wiping away a tear that rolled down her cheek. On one of the pages she had written, To my Katherine, when you feel alone, remember that God is closest when your heart is broken. Aunt Grace audibly sobbed from her seat, and several members of the congregation began crying openly as well. So, Lucy, when you ask me what God means to me, I say that He is that moment when you open an old Bible and find words of love written by someone who's no longer here. He is that inexplicable force that makes us keep going when we think we can't take another step. Katherine gently opened the Bible Lucy was holding. You have notes from your grandmother in here too, don't you? Lucy nodded, her tears now falling onto the yellowed pages. She always wrote little messages for me, she whispered. See? Katherine smiled gently. God works through these small things, through the love that remains even after the people we cherish are gone, through the courage of a little girl who asks a profound question in a church full of adults. The afternoon sun began to set, casting golden rays through the stained glass and creating an almost magical moment in the church. But what happened next would touch everyone's hearts even more deeply. Lucy, Katherine said softly, do you know why your question touched me so deeply? The girl shook her head, still clutching her Bible to her chest. Because you reminded me that in the end, it doesn't matter how much money we have, how many companies we build, or how many awards we win. What matters is our connection to something greater than ourselves. Katherine slowly stood, but kept her eyes fixed on Lucy. When I built my company, people always asked me about strategies, investments, and numbers. But you, an 8-year-old girl, asked me the only question that truly matters. A murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation. A woman in the front row softly exclaimed, "Amen," her voice thick with emotion. "Lucy, God isn't just the answer to your questions. He is the strength that gave you the courage to ask this question today. He is the reason your grandmother wrote all those notes in your Bible, knowing that one day you'd find them and understand." Katherine then did something unexpected. She removed her necklace, a delicate gold crucifix she always wore. "This necklace belonged to my grandmother. She gave it to me when I was your age, saying it was a reminder that we are never truly alone." With gentle hands, she placed the necklace around Lucy's neck. "Now it's yours, to remind you of this moment and that God works through honest questions and open hearts." Lucy touched the crucifix with trembling fingers, fresh tears shining in her eyes. Aunt Grace had quietly moved closer and was now standing beside her niece, her own tears falling freely. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you today," Katherine whispered, "as proud as mine is of me." The entire church seemed to hold its breath, witnessing a moment of connection so profound that it transcended any barriers of age, status, or circumstance. An elderly lady leaning on her cane slowly rose from the front row. "Miss Williams," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "I've been coming to this church for 50 years, but I've never seen anyone explain faith so beautifully." Katherine smiled gently at the lady but kept a protective hand on Lucy's shoulder. "The purest faith," she responded, "often comes through the simplest questions." "My granddaughter recently passed away, too," the elderly lady continued, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "And I've been struggling to understand why. But listening to you today, maybe the answers we seek aren't as complicated as we think." Lucy looked at the elderly lady, then at Katherine, and then did something surprising. With small but determined steps, she walked over to the woman and held out her Bible. "My grandmother always said that stories of faith need to be shared," she said softly. The elderly lady took the Bible with trembling hands, opening it carefully. In the margins, Lucy's grandmother's notes glimmered like small treasures of wisdom. Katherine watched the scene, deeply moved. "Do you see?" she said, now addressing the entire congregation. "This is how God works. Through small gestures of love, through open hearts, through the honest questions of a child." The church pastor, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, now stood. His own tears were visible as he approached the group. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice resonating through the church, "today we have witnessed something extraordinary. We didn't just hear an answer about faith. We saw faith in action." The entire congregation seemed to vibrate with a special energy, as if something sacred was unfolding before their eyes. The pastor bowed his head for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, before continuing. "Miss Williams came here today to talk about success and leadership. But God had other plans. Through the innocent question of a child, He reminded us of what truly matters." Katherine smiled, tears still glistening in her eyes. "Pastor, do you know what's most incredible? When I woke up this morning, I thought I was coming here to share my story of success. Instead, Lucy helped me share my story of faith." Lucy, still standing next to the elderly lady, held the crucifix around her neck with one hand while holding the lady's wrinkled hand with the other. The moment seemed to create a bridge between generations, between different life experiences, but united by the same faith. "Years ago," Katherine continued, her voice now stronger, "when I was starting my company, a reporter asked me what the secret to my success was. I gave him an answer about hard work and perseverance. But today, Lucy made me realize I should have told the truth. My secret has always been my faith. The congregation murmured in agreement, several heads nodding in understanding. A young mother in the third row hugged her small daughter, silent tears streaming down her face. When you have faith, Katherine continued, you understand that success isn't measured by the digits in a bank account. It's measured by the hearts you touch, the lives you change, the moments like this where God uses you as an instrument of His grace. The sun was now lower on the horizon, its final rays filtering through the stained glass windows, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to dance around everyone present. The moment felt blessed, as if heaven itself was bearing witness to this special connection. A middle-aged woman slowly rose from her seat. "Miss Williams," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "for 20 years I worked as a teacher in a public school. Every day I saw children struggling not just with poverty, but with a lack of hope. How did you keep your faith when everything seemed impossible?" Katherine looked at Lucy, then at the teacher. "You know, there's a story I've never told in public before. When I was 16, I was on the verge of dropping out of school. We were poor, I needed to work, and it seemed like studying was a luxury we couldn't afford." The church remained in absolute silence, every person completely absorbed in the story. One night I found my mother crying in the kitchen. She had just finished her third shift at work. When I asked her what was wrong, she opened her Bible and showed me a verse she had marked. "I can do all things through Him who strengthens me." Then she told me something I never forgot. "Katherine, our situation is temporary, but the education you receive will be forever." Lucy clutched the crucifix around her neck, her wide eyes fixed on Katherine. "So when people ask me how I kept my faith during hard times, I say it was by remembering my mother's words, my grandmother's notes in her Bible, and believing that God doesn't give us dreams without also giving us the strength to achieve them." The teacher was now openly crying, as were many others in the congregation. "Miss Williams," she said, "may I share that story with my students?" Katherine smiled gently. "Please do. And tell them that a black woman who grew up in poverty is standing here today not just because of hard work, but because she believed in the promises written in an old Bible." The moment that followed would deepen the transformation of that unforgettable afternoon. Katherine stood, looking out at everyone in the church with a gentle smile. "Today, I came here thinking I would teach you something. Instead, an 8-year-old girl taught me, and all of us, the most important lesson of all." She knelt again beside Lucy. "A child's faith is the purest there is because it comes from a heart that has not yet learned to doubt. Lucy, your question not only changed my life today, but I'm sure it touched every person in this church." The pastor stepped forward with a microphone. "Before we close, Miss Williams, I have one final question. What would you say to others who are struggling with their faith?" Katherine looked at Lucy, then at the congregation. "I would say that sometimes we need to return to having the faith of a child. We need to ask the hard questions with open hearts. And above all, we need to remember that God often speaks through the most unlikely voices, like a brave little girl in a crowded church." Lucy smiled, her tears now replaced by a glow of understanding in her eyes. Aunt Grace hugged her tightly, whispering words of pride in her ear. "If this story touched your heart today," Katherine concluded, "remember that sometimes the greatest truths come from the simplest questions. And perhaps, as Lucy showed us, all we need to do is have the courage to ask." The congregation rose in an emotional applause. As people began to disperse, many came forward to hug Lucy and thank Katherine. The sun had completely set now, but the light of faith that had been ignited that afternoon would continue to shine in everyone's hearts for a long time. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs hope today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart and nourish the soul.